Good afternoon and welcome to the London Art Week series, Art History in Focus. The focus of this episode is an extraordinary late medieval monument, the so-called Well of Moses or Great Cross, from a charter house just outside Dijon in Burgundy. My name is Alexandra Gajewski. I'm the deputy editor of the Burlington Magazine, and it is a great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Susie Nash from the Courtauld Institute in London, who has just published in our recent issue, in the November issue, what is clearly the definitive account of this Well of Moses. Susie offers conclusive evidence of the meaning of the work and also of the intentions of the patron, and on top provides an authoritative reconstruction of what the monument looked like originally. I should just say that this is a long-standing research project for Susie. She has published already 3 articles with the Burlington Magazine in 2005, 2006, and 2008. Together, these 4 articles are really something of a masterclass of how scholarly research should be done, taking into account original documents, later archival sources, as well as, of course, the physical evidence. Hello, Susie.
Hello, Alexandra. Thank you for that very kind introduction, which does make it sound like I am very obsessed with this monument. And I think it would be fair to say that I am and have been over many years. So it's a pleasure to be here and welcome everyone to speak a little bit more about the research and its process.
Well, we can't wait. I'm sure I talk for our attendees as well. Um, but Susie, before we get down to the nitty-gritty of your argument or arguments about this, perhaps we should just remind ourselves what this monument looks like, where it is, and in which context it was built.
Yes, certainly.
Could I also, while I'm putting up the first slide, remind viewers that there is a possibility of putting your queries into the Q&A, and we'll deal with as many of them as we can at the end of the webinar.
Okay, so thank you. So just to try and introduce this monument, which is never very easy, in some ways it's a unicorn. There's nothing else quite like it that you can compare it to. And trying to understand it physically is difficult, just from photographs. It is monumental. The figures on it, who are prophets, there are 6 prophets who stand on the monument on each side. It's hexagonal. They are life size. The monument itself that we see today stood about 5 meters high. And that was just really the base of the object. On top of it was a monumental cross, now destroyed. And one of the problems that we have when we look at the Well of Moses is really to try and reconstruct that cross. And that was probably about another 7 meters, maybe on top. So we're talking about something that from the ground was about 11 or 12 meters high. Not only that, it was certainly designed to be seen, of course, in 360 degrees and from a distance. Um, and it was fully polychromed and gilded. It would have looked like a monumental piece of metalwork when it was first unveiled, which was extraordinary for many reasons, and not least that it's out in the open air. And one would have thought it's not very practical to spend so much money on gilding and painting something that was going to be open to the elements. It caused its own problems. So we have this hexagonal monument with prophets standing on it, angels between them, a cross on top, and the whole was sequestered within a Carthusian monastery outside Dijon, as Alexandra mentioned. And the Carthusians were an order who were certainly enclosed and not, they weren't a preaching order. They did not welcome, in general, visitors to their monastery, certainly not to the cloister that the monument stood in. So this you can see that little building in the middle of the cloister here on the reconstruction, the drawing of the Chartreuse de Champmont. That's where the Well of Moses was. And so it's in the middle of this large cloister, which was the most really sacred space within the monastery. So you've got a very interesting question of audience here. Who was this made for? Who was going to see it? And I should also point out that one of the reasons I'm showing you a drawing here from the 17th century is because just after the revolution, the monastery was almost completely destroyed. And we only really have the Well of Moses on site now and a couple of other fragments, portal and a few other smaller things. So it's very difficult to really reconstruct. And if anyone has ever been there today, it's quite a strange experience as well, because it has been for some time a psychiatric hospital. And so in itself, there's quite an experience in visiting it and trying to comprehend it. Oh, one other thing I should say, I don't think I've mentioned the well, that this is sunk deep in a well, the pillar that the prophets are on. And so where you view it today, you actually walk inside the well and over that walkway. So you get very close to it. But originally, it wouldn't have been designed to be seen like that. And the little building you see there in that drawing was built in the 17th century as well.
It's such an extraordinary work. I mean, well, how wonderful. But I understand, Susie, behind this Well of Moses is also an exceptional patron from the highest echelons and equally exceptional artist. Could
Yes.
you tell us about those?
Certainly, I didn't mention either of those quite deliberately. And I should say that the monument itself was built at the end of the 14th century. It took 10 years. So between 1395 to 1404 really was its construction. And it was made for this man, Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, who was, I think, really arguably the most powerful, you could even say one of the most powerful men in Europe, and certainly in France during this period. He was the son of a king, the brother to another king, and the uncle to a third king. So he was the brother of Charles V of France, and then he's uncle to Charles VI. And when he's building the Well of Moses, the Great Cross, it's a point when he is more or less really holding the reins of power in France, because his nephew, Charles VI, has periodic bouts of madness. And Philip is a political animal. He's very wealthy, and he's dealing Europe wide, not just within France. So this is someone who is a very, I think politically he's very astute, and he's really thinking of his dynasty as well and his future. And part of this dynasty and future is founding this monastery, the Chartreuse de Champmont. So he builds this from scratch. He builds it as a mausoleum for his family. It's where he is going to be buried. And you see there on the bottom part of the screen below the drawing of the Chartreuse, a drawing of the tomb that was created by Klaus Schluter, who is the artist who produced the Well of Moses for the church at Champmont. So Philip is going to be buried here. So this is something that every aspect of it is designed with his family and his commemoration in mind. The tomb, partly destroyed, partly still survives. And if we go on to the next slide, maybe I could say something about the artist. So the artist he gets for these monumental projects, for the Well of Moses, for the tomb, and for the portal. And you see an image of Philip here on the portal of the church that is still in situ in Champmont, where the portal is someone who he's brought down from the Netherlands, and Klaus Schluter is, I think, very, very adept at carving in stone, certainly, and running a big workshop. And he produces the tomb, the portal, and the well most memorably for this monument and for this patron. Now, Schluter is these objects are canonical and famous, but Schluter himself is canonical, and he's someone who sort of sits in this 1400 period, somewhere between medieval and Renaissance, and he's often seen as a kind of pivotal person within that change, as it's often set up between Gothic and Renaissance style. And indeed, he is called by some scholars the Donatello of the North. And Panofsky, I think, even compares him to Michelangelo and Bernini. and says there are elements of both these sculptors in his style. And I think this is probably because he carves very powerful figures, very dramatic figures often, and he's also technically absolutely brilliant. What he can do with stone, the surfaces and the effects he can create, but also I think he's very daring in how he undercuts things. So he's technically brilliant and also has, I think, the luck as well to have these monumental works surviving. So there's sort of bit of luck in terms of the fact that we know quite a lot about him in documentary terms. We have these works surviving, and what we do have surviving is really very extraordinary.
This underlines so well also the importance of the Well of Moses by Philip the Bold and by Klaus Schlüter, then had been studied, of course, before you started. So I'm just thinking back to when you started working on this, and before we go to your latest research, I think it would be helpful to know a bit more about this backstory. How did you start on this? I think there was a great discovery that you made right at the beginning, and it's connected with Mary Magdalene.
Yes, yes. And in fact, yes, I think it's probably worth saying something about the status quo in a sense, the point at which I came into the scholarship on this, because I say it's a canonical monument, and people had made various attempts to reconstruct it, to understand what the cross looked like on top of this base with the prophets. And this had been done since the first reconstruction you see here, which is in some ways maybe the most interesting because it's three-dimensional. It's on a small scale. The polychromy there is modern, but was done in the 1840s. And at which point, and for the next 150 years, it was assumed that on top of this terrace, on top of the figures of the prophets, and below the cross was, in a way, a kind of standard crucifixion group with the Virgin, with John the Evangelist, and with the Magdalene. And this had various reconstructions of what they might look like and what the cross might look like were put forward on the basis of that. Now, partly this was because we had a certain amount of document. We had a lot of documentation, actually, very rich documentation. However, the documentation talks about all the figures on this monument and the Magdalene, but it does not mention anywhere a St. John. And there is one mention that is very ambiguous that could be about a virgin, but I really believe very strongly it was for a virgin. It was a virgin for another project entirely. So we have this dense documentation, which actually, when you looked at it, when I first started work on this, I looked at the documentation and I thought, this doesn't make sense. Where are these other figures? Why aren't they mentioned? We know everything. We know the boxes they're made. They're sent to the Champmollion. We know about their polychromy. We know so much detail. And the other piece of evidence we had, which was really fundamental, were the fragments that were found in the well. And it was dragged in the 19th century, just before that reconstruction was made in the 1840s. And they found the arms of the Magdalene, and they found the legs of Christ that you see there. And they found a few other fragments, mostly of the cross, and there wasn't a single fragment that could relate to John or the Virgin. So we have this physical evidence that suggests the Magdalene was alone, and the documentary evidence that suggests the Magdalene was alone, but not an easy thing to prove. So maybe if we go on to the next slide. So my theory that Magdalene was alone at the foot of the cross was, something that no one had ever considered before. There was a range of evidence I could put forward for it, extra to what I've presented here that I won't go into. But one of the key things I needed to find out was what the top of the monument looked like. And amazingly, no one had ever photographed it. They'd restored it. I was just starting work on this in 2005, just after it had come out of restoration, which was very lucky for me. Because the polychromy was very vivid, and also the viewpoint on it was dramatically changed because the walkway was lowered so you could really see it from below. All of that was very helpful. But no one had ever thought to document or photograph what the top was like. and why this mattered. And why it mattered was because if those figures of John and the Virgin were up there, they would have to have been fixed there with some sort of metal fixings. And so I had to, you see, this is a photo of me looking up at the, with rather sort of trepidation of how am I going to manage to see the top of this monument. And I figured if you see in that photograph, there are some lights on in the building, and I figured if someone goes up there to change the bulbs for those lights, then they must have a ladder. And so I persuaded the people at the hospital to give me a ladder, and I climbed up, which was truly terrifying, and took the photograph that you see above me there, which shows part at least of the terrace. And you can see this iron rod that was for the fixing for the cross that would have gone up from there. But there were no other fixings for any figures actually on the top. And this made sense because the Magdalene was actually kneeling, and we know her arms were crossed and they were around the cross. So you didn't need that for a kneeling figure of the Magdalene, but for the standing figure of John and the Virgin, there was no space for them. The other image in 2018, I think it's quite interesting because I took not with a ladder, but with literally a very, very long pole with a camera on top of it. And what I realized was how dirty it's got over the subsequent years from 2005 to 2018. And I think if I'd gone up there maybe in 2018, I wouldn't have been able to be absolutely certain there was nothing, what could I have seen on the top? It would have been much harder to do. So there was a certain amount of serendipity in my timing on this, I think. And yes, and so this really helped clinch the idea that the Magdalene was alone. The other thing I learned from the top, which is worth saying because it has relevance to what's coming next, is that the cross, as you can see from the old reconstruction and then my new reconstruction in 2005, is that the cross was orientated over a point of the hexagon, not over a flat face. And the point of the hexagon, and I could tell this from the top, was between David and Jeremiah. And this made Jeremiah quite, why were those two figures the ones that were prominent?
That is such a fantastic detective story, Susie. Going up on this ladder, I mean, it's so tall.
Mm. I did think about my children briefly, but only briefly.
But I mean, when you talked earlier, it made it sound like you had it all wrapped up at the time. But you've already hinted just right now that that was not perhaps the case. And Jeremiah is, I think, important in this context. So what made you turn back to the subject after you had published this? What were the doubts that you had that more needed to be done?
Yeah.
Should I go forward to the next slide, perhaps?
Slide, yes. So when I finished the last article in 2008, one of the things that I had developed from this new reconstruction was thinking about Jeremiah more carefully. And he was an extraordinary figure on the cross. He's now very prominent because he's at the front of the cross, and he was unbearded, and he actually originally had metal eyeglasses as well, spectacles, which long lost, but we know them from the documents. And he was dressed in in quite an unusual way as well. The way he was, the color of his robes, which was a very distinctive red, and also the decoration of them. And so I had questions about him. And then if you go on to the next slide. And one of the things I realized and did publish in 2008, and it came as quite a shock to me when I first really registered this, is that he was actually a portrait of the patron, Philip the Bold. And you see here a comparison of Jeremiah's figure with Philip, sculpted form that was made about 10 years earlier by Klaus Sluter, and also a drawing of the effigy on his tomb. And there are other comparisons you could make with other portraits of Philip, which work just as well, really. And this, to me, was certainly quite baffling. And I explained it in a particular way in 2008. I thought about it in relationship to the Carthusians. I had to think, why would Philip want to be Jeremiah? Why would he want to be that prophet? Why would he want to be on the well at all? And you could think about commemoration, perhaps. And I I explained it in relation to the interest the Carthusians had in Jeremiah, and which they did. He was a prophet. They were very um, attached to, because he sat in the wilderness in the way that they saw themselves as outside of society as well. Um, but I knew it really wasn't a very satisfactory solution. I realized that it didn't, to me, there was something that was nagging. And to be truthful, I haven't really, coming back to it, I've never really left it. I've been thinking about it really for the last 15 or so years. But I do owe the path that I then took that helped me understand it to two things. Really, well, maybe several things, but I realized that maybe the words that he held were going to be very important. And the words he holds are part of the title of the new article. Which basically, um, all ye who pass by the way, look and see if there is any sorrow like unto my sorrow, a sort of paraphrase of it. So they're about sorrow. And I owe really the next step to Jeff Nuttall, who a colleague and art historian and friend, who did say to me after the 2008 article, do you think that that reference to sorrow might be about Philip's sorrow over the Battle of Nicopolis? And I thought, oh my goodness, this could be what's going on here. That there maybe I felt that the words might make sense. So I had a clue that it was worth looking in that direction. But that was, in a way, it was just a clue at that point. And um, the next thing that really helped, oh, the other thing I wanted to explain, thank you. So there were other things that I didn't really feel I'd explained or hadn't had a chance to go into. And one of them, without doubt, was just how heavily gilded and polychromed it was, and how richly carved the figures of the prophets were in particular. They are wearing the most elaborate of dress. And at this date, around 1400, this is not what prophets wear. They wear much more sort of generic robes, and the idea that they have all this very kind of elaborate patterned material that they're enveloped in, that has all this fabulous decoration on its borders, and belts and pen cases and their shoes, everything about them was really far more elaborate than, and I didn't really know why, especially inside this cloister, which is a Carthusian monastery, which is meant to be about restraint in many ways. And also, who is seeing this? So these were all these sort of questions that I wanted to answer, and they tied together. So I had this question about, what did those words mean for Philip? And is that why he was Jeremiah? And then can I explain more about the actual appearance of this object, the style of the detail of the prophets, as well as this incredible sort of glitzy surface. It was, I mean, what you're seeing there is ultramarine blue. This is incredibly expensive. And the prophets that were mostly fully gilded, we've lost so much of the gold, but there are little traces of it that you see here and there, glinting, I think, a little bit on the robe of Daniel on the far left. So this was an extraordinary monument that needed explaining. So
Did you find that the colors are not did they deteriorate in the years since 2005?
yeah, I think they have. Just like the top has got dirty, I think it has.
Mm.
It's rather frightening that they have got. So a lot of these photographs are taken. The one with the really strong blue, which has got the harps carved in, that's from David's robe. These were taken now 15 or so years ago, maybe more, nearly 20 years ago. And I think it has got less. I think it has dulled down, and it's difficult because although it has this building surrounding it, it is still open to the elements to an extent, and it is not in a. It's not in a. Obviously, it's not in some sort of uh, I said context where it is fully conserved, because it actually belongs to the hospital, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
They are in charge of it, really. And so access to it, and who is going to, and also it's inaccessible. I mean, it's in this well, so you can't easily sort of, get close to it and put a duster over it if you wanted to. And I think that's part of it was another thing that actually needed explaining. Why do you build an object like this in the middle of a well?
Well, quite. I can see that. So Jeff Nuttall's suggestion about Nicopolis, the preciousness of the objects, of the sculptures. And I think we need the full reveal now. What did this lead you to, and where was your starting point to find the answers?
Yeah. So I think, do you want to go on to the next slide?
Yes,
So I think it's worth me saying, first of all, something about Nicopolis, because I've thrown this in, but one of the things I've realized as I've worked on this topic is while French audiences, I think, are quite aware of the trauma of this battle for the French in the late 14th century, I think English uh, readers or people who are interested in history of this period are not maybe as aware of it. And it's interesting that it gets edited out of lots of editions of Froissart's Chronicles, for example. But it was one of the most traumatic moments in French history at this period. I think it was more traumatic than Agincourt, really. And what happens is Philip the Bold really is the main mover in pulling together a army to take a crusade to into Turkey, and he gives the lead of that to his son John the Fearless, and he puts all of his best people and his closest friends around his son and sends them off in great glory to crusade to ultimately the aim, of course, is the Holy Land. But initially, it's really into Turkey and Hungary. And what happens is absolute disaster. There is a battle at Nicopolis in September 1396, and it wipes out the French army. And there are other nations that are involved in this as well, mostly the Hungarians. And this is an absolute disaster. It really takes a whole swathe out of the all the sort of sons of the noble families in France are lost, and Philip's son John the Fearless is taken captive. And it is also very violent. There is, a moment when Bayezid, the Ottoman emperor, does really sort of chop to pieces a lot of John's men and makes him watch. So it's a very, very traumatic moment in every way. And Philip then has to scramble to try and get a huge ransom together, absolutely vast ransom together to get John back as a hostage that Bayezid has him held. So this happens at this, so that's Nicopolis. And you've got to remember that Philip is right at the heart of this. He organizes the crusade, he funds the crusade. It's his son who's been taken captive and who was really responsible actually for the battle going so horribly wrong at Nicopolis. He just rushed in and didn't take heed of the advice of his men. And Philip also lost some of his very best friends. So the idea of his sorrow was well known in France. When news of this hits, France goes into deep mourning, and Philip's sorrow is in a sense legendary. But how do I? So sorry, go on.
where is Nicopolis?
Oh, Nicopolis. Okay, it's in current day Bulgaria,
Area. Mm-hmm.
and but when they talk about it in the sources as the mission to Hungary,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
how they talk about it. So I've always thought that I really do need to actually try and retrace John's steps. He set out from Dijon with his army, and I think it's something that would be very interesting to sort of actually. I've never been there, and I'd like to go there. Nothing left, of course, to see, but nevertheless, just to get a sense of place.
What an
Um,
extraordinary story. Mm.
yeah. And but how I really tied this to the well was actually through a completely different sort of element of research and a completely different source, but one that I found has been incredibly useful, which are antiquarian writers in the 17th and 18th century. And there is one writer called J.P. Gilquin, and you see his fabulous folio volume here on the Chartreuse de Champmont. And he lived all his life in Dijon. He knew the Charterhouse terribly well. And he produces images of the tomb that we saw. Frustratingly, he never did a drawing of the well. I think it's in the cloister, it's in this building. He knows it, he's seen it, from a distance, but he doesn't bother, unfortunately, to record it other than in words. And what he says about it is I'd always overlooked because, it was only a few lines and doesn't tell us very much. But there was an element that had been edited out from anyone's use of this source, where he says at the beginning that it was made in September 1396. And so he gives to the Well of Moses the date of the battle at Nicopolis, which made no sense as a date for when the monument was begun. It was founded in 1395. It isn't a date that ties into any of the making of the well or the completion of it, but it is the date of the battle. And it's how people used to refer to Nicopolis as, it's September 1396. They do refer to that, its month and its year. And so that for me was, in a way, really a sort of smoking gun to think, okay, this really gives me reason to think that there is some sort of tradition and history. Maybe there was something on the well, some sort of date, some sort of, at least a tradition of that was maybe an oral tradition at the monastery that linked the well to the battle.
Extraordinary.
And so that's where I really started from. And then the combination of really thinking about why Philip might want to be Jeremiah, because the point about being Jeremiah is that Jeremiah's words, this statement from Lamentations, in a way, it's not just those words which are relevant. The rest of Lamentations that follow on after that are all about the loss of sons, the idea of the retaking of Jerusalem, the loss of Jerusalem, the fall of Jerusalem. It's actually a text which has wonderful resonance for everything that happened at Nicopolis.
And how do you feel that commissioning the well would have helped him? How would that, in this sorrow, how would that have consoled him? What would it have done?
Yes, so and I think the thing is it's complicated because you have to track the history of the foundation of it. So he founds the cross. He has the idea to have a cross made at Champmont when he, I think, takes the vow to crusade. So when Philip vows to crusade and then he passes the lead of it onto his son, that's the moment he's in Dijon and he's making that decision. He says, I'm going to found a cross. So initially, the Great Cross is about that vow to crusade, I think. And then the crusade sets off from Dijon and he hears this, and while they're traveling, they're digging the foundations for the cross and the well. And then news of the disaster hits France. And at that point, work on the well stops. And it stops for about 18 months. And it stops really until the point when Philip gets his son back safely, when he comes back to Dijon. And then they start work on it again. And more or less it matches almost, really, you can see this hiatus. And so my theory is that he's building this cross that is related to the Crusades in the first place. Then there's this terrible sort of disaster. And so the purpose of the cross shifts and it becomes something that is, in part it's a memorial to those that, who were lost at Nicopolis, and a memorial about Philip's sorrow. But more than that, I think it actually is connected into the vow that I believe he made to, or in thanks rather, for the safe return of his son. Because during this period, everything Philip is thinking about is how he's going to get his son back. This is a real concern. And he, I think, sees the cross as a kind of gift to God for the safe return of his son. So I think and what we have to remember is none of the imagery on it, and I think even its form isn't really set in place until he knows his son is back, and he knows that in a sense God has granted him that gift. And there are, I think there's some evidence as well, and quite a lot of evidence in the documentary sources, that the monument is expanded also at this point, that it gets bigger, that more stone is brought, and they're rethinking it. And I think also that kind of gift in thanks for when you ask God for something and that it is then given, is often, it needs to be extraordinary, it needs to be very, very rich. Often they're made of gold. In this case, of course, he can't make it of gold, but he makes it look like gold with the gilding and the polychrome.
That is so compelling and really convincing.
Well, I hope I've put more. There's much more evidence in the article, so
Yes,
it feels. But either way, I've given a very potted summary of it here. But that fundamentally, I think it relates not just to Philip's sorrow over the disaster, but to his thanksgiving to God for the return of his son.
yes, absolutely. And of course, attendees to the webinar can read your article free of charge. There'll be a link provided with a registration, and even also there's a link for 50% discount to the digital subscription, which would allow access to the back articles 2005, 2006, and 8, and much more, of course. So there is that option open to everyone. But I would like to continue to ask you, Susie, because one of the extraordinary things about your essay in the Burlington Magazine is that it includes also a new reconstruction of the cross. You'd shown us a couple of slides ago, your 2006 one, I think it was, and you have made a new one. What necessitated going back to the question, what the
Mm.
big great cross looked like?
Yeah.
And perhaps also how did you go about it? What sources did you use for this? And
Yes.
how did you do it?
Okay. Thank you. Do you want to go on
Mhm.
to
Yes,
the reconstruction, which is a fabulous drawing done for me by the amazing illustrator Mathilde Grimaldi, who hopefully it's coming up.
yes, sorry. Yeah.
There we go. Okay. So you see my
So
initial reconstruction, my initial reconstruction there. Um, and partly the initial reconstruction was done in haste. I was working quite fast on these first articles, and I had ideas about, I wanted to get across the idea that the cross should be seen from this angled viewpoint, not from the flat side of the hexagon. I wanted to get across that the Magdalene was kneeling alone and there was nothing else there in terms of John and the Virgin. And I also wanted to get across the idea that there was this deep base that was very important that you saw as well, that the other reconstructions just ignored. And also the height of the cross. I knew it was much taller than we thought. However, there were things about it that I really, hadn't, there wasn't nearly enough detail on it. And also the viewpoint for me was too steep at an angle, and I knew that I'd made the cross too long, at least the column of the cross too long. So there were things that I did this in collaboration with Tom Bilson, and at the time, I say we worked very fast, and also actually in terms of, I guess, the kind of tools that you had at hand, even in 2005, to do a
Mm-hmm.
production like this. And in the subsequent years, I worked with Mathilde on a reconstruction of or really a kind of exploding diagram of how the tomb of Philip the Bold was made. So I knew she was just fabulous at visualizing things which could be very complex. And we worked together on this. It took some time. I mean, poor Mathilde, I kept on saying, no, can you adjust this? Can you adjust that? And she was brilliant at working that through. And she also was very clear that we should do a reconstruction from seen head on. And also I wanted to get a sense of the wider space around the well a little bit. So you got a sense of how far you were kept as a spectator from it too. The other thing that I was unhappy with in the first reconstruction was the cross. I I had suspicion that the original cross was a double cross, like you see here, and I wanted to try and get that idea across. And I also wanted much more detail on it. So working with the evidence we have. So we have some sort of drawings and engravings from the 19th century. So after the cross has fallen down, so it doesn't tell us anything about the cross, but it shows things like those P's and M's that you have around the cornice there below the Magdalene, and also the arms, these fabulous sort of sunburst with the coat of arms of the Burgundian Duke on the base, which I did have in the first reconstruction, but they weren't properly to scale. And I wanted to kind of get those things across too. And those have all been been wonderfully realized by Mathilde. But of course, some of this, I must point out, is very hypothetical. You know, we have really the arms of the Magdalene. We have a record that there was a fragment of her hair, so we know she had long flowing hair. I have evidence of where she knelt from the top of the cross, which is why I've put her slightly more at an angle as well. I'm not absolutely certain if she is full on, like I've shown her in the first reconstruction. I suspect she might have been just slightly to one side. It would have made a slightly more interesting viewpoint, I think. But I don't, I have to rely on what is said in the accounts about the construction of the cross, that it was, and also some of the fragments which are now lost, that it was a column and that you had these two parts to it. And there are hints in the documents as well about the double cross, and also these coats of arms that were on the ends of the cross. We have those recorded in the documents. But part of it is it has to be just very, we have to sort of put these little fragments of evidence together. And then I also worked with images from the period by artists who are very closely tied to Sluter or the Chartreuse de Champmont. For example, the de Lambaud brothers, they are the nephews of Jean Mauwel, who produced the polychromy of the well. And I think they must have known this object. They are the sort of people who could have probably got access to the cloister. And in some of the de Lambaud miniatures, you see a Magdalene kneeling at the foot of the cross like this. And so I've used those kind of things too. There was also a copy of the cross made in 1508 that unfortunately the cross also fell down, but there's a drawing of that was helpful, and that has a double cross. So there was all these bits of evidence that I could put together that visually helped me do this. And we had some descriptions of other things like the sunburst halo, you see. That's something that is described in as fragments of that were found in the well. And frustratingly, all these fragments just disappeared at some point in the 19th century, apart from the arms and the legs. So I'm sure I've got more to say, but that's
Maybe I can ask the P and M. So P for Philip and M for his wife. Is that right?
Yes, M for Margaret. Yes. So throughout the Chartreuse de Champmont, there are P's and M's everywhere. It's what's interesting with the Great Cross is that the concentration of emblems and heraldry and the coats of arms, but also the colors even work in a heraldic way for the prophets and the angels too. It feels very, very dense at this point, which is a very, very private part of the monastery. This is not was not intended for public show. I think certain very high-ranking individuals would have seen it, but people are not rushing into the cloister to look at this. Really, they're not. I think they might have been intended to be able to see the top of it from a distance as you approach Dijon from the Paris road. I feel that probably would have initially been the idea. But very soon they had to cover it up because it was a daft idea to polychrome this and gild it so extensively. And it must have been starting to show signs of weathering. In fact, we know it was because they say we have to put a tent over it because to protect it from the wind and the rain. And so they put this tent over it just a few years after it was made to protect it. So it becomes even more hidden.
And then the building in the 17th century, the first building.
Yeah. Then they put the more substantial building over it later on. So it is hidden.
Who would have seen it initially, really, apart from Philip?
Well, Philip certainly. I mean, the Carthusians. I mean, the idea that this is in when I published the article in 2008, I thought very much about the Carthusian audience, the Carthusians who all have their little cells around the outside of the monastery, but they. And I do feel, obviously, this is a monument for them. The whole point about all this sort of intensity of heraldry and Philip's image on it is for the monks to pray for his family and his, basically the salvation of his soul and those of his descendants. So that is still there as a primary audience. A very limited one, but then there are also some very certainly high-ranking ecclesiastics would have seen it. We have people like Cardinal Orsini and Cardinal Albergati who come to the monastery and give indulgences, which are basically promises that you will have time off your time in purgatory if you say certain prayers in front of the the Great Cross, and they were designed primarily actually for the inmates of the monastery to say. Uh, but this is something that would have been seen by these sort of people. And I'm sure René of Anjou, for example, he's kept in captivity in Dijon by Philip the Good. And I'm absolutely certain he knew this.
Mm.
So, there are high-ranking people are going to go into the cloister and see
Mm.
it and are going to be shown it, but it's not going to be really a kind of wider public. I think the one of the key audiences for this is really God. You're making this splendid for for the glory to God and in thanks for that, for the return of his son.
Of course, absolutely. So important to remember. Maybe we have the view of both front and
Oh,
back.
yes.
Oh,
Yes, yes. So the other thing that Mathilde did, which was very challenging, and I think she's done a wonderful job with it, is to imagine what it looked like from the back as well. I mean, ideally, what one would look, one would try and have a sort of sense of it from all sides, um, and how the cross would have worked from front and back. I really did want to get some sort of sense of that because I think it was designed very much to be seen from these, as you walked around the cloister, you would have seen it from all different angles. And so we tried to give a kind of sense of that.
it's extraordinary to see this and to see it as one would have seen it walking around it.
Mm, yeah. I think that they're planning to do um, a 3D printed um, reconstruction of it for the de Lambourg show that is going to be on next year in France and have it fully colored. So that will be, I mean, they're not going to, I don't think they're going to reconstruct the cross, to be fair. I think they're just going to do the base. But, getting a sense of, and we did think, Matilda and I did think about doing a colored version, and we may still do one. But initially, that can look very, although we know a lot about the polychrome, it can look very garish. And so I think that the black and white version, I'm very pleased with. I think it works very well.
Yes, yes, absolutely. It gives such a good impression. Really, it's a revelation. Thank you, Susie. That was wonderful. Is there something you would like to add at this stage, or shall we have a look at the questions?
So I think I'm sure the trouble with the Well of Moses is I could probably talk about it for days on end. So I should probably stop.
Um, well, there is so much to say, but there are questions that are coming in, and perhaps that will be a good idea to have a look at them. I should say for people who are putting their questions into the Q&A, we may not have time to answer all of them, but we will make a transcript of all the questions, so yours will not be ignored if we don't read them out. But here is Tim Node with a question who says, thank you, Susie. Do the inscriptions on the scrolls of the other prophets also relate to the Crusade theory? Might Jeremiah's Lamentations be relevant to sorrow about the crucifixion?
Of course. I mean, all of this, two things there. One, yes, they do. And part of what I developed in the article was very much how the other inscriptions that the other prophets are holding are about themes of sacrifice um, and violence in a sense. Actually, they very much feed into this idea. And so, yes, they do. And I think I would just direct you to the article to read my interpretations of those. And of course, the other thing to remember is that in putting forward this explanation, that is not to then say that the idea of this cross as being to the whole monument as being about sorrow of the crucifixion. That is absolutely there, always there. And the Magdalene, of course, feeds into that. She feeds into the idea of, because she is known, obviously, for her great sorrow at the foot of the cross. And I think having her there on her own just emphasizes that theme. And so Lamentations, so the no sorrow like unto my sorrow, one of the things I talk about is it's a very, very adaptable and very, very useful and almost ubiquitous quotation from Lamentations that gets used for the Virgin and her sorrow. It gets used for the Magdalene and her sorrow. It gets used for even things like Dante uses it in Sorrow over Beatrice. There are ways in which this is a kind of a trope, really. So I wouldn't want to say that on its own is not going to be just about Nicopolis. It's doing everything on this monument actually does double duty, I feel, or triple duty. This in putting forward this reading of it, I really don't want to negate the fact that this is a crucifix and this is about the sacrifice of Christ, as well as the sacrifice that Philip has made of all these men. His best friend, his very best friend, who was buried, he was in his will is requested that he is buried at Philip's feet at Champmont, dies at Nicopolis, and the whole of the other thing I should say is that the other thing I really found that fed into this is that the Chartreuse de Champmont became a place where there was a kind of locus of commemoration for the knights who fell at Champmont. So sorry, who fell at Nicopolis. So there is a lot of things going on there. So yes, there was. Yes, I noticed. Should we go to Jeffrey's question next? Can you see that, Jeffrey Ruder, who says?
Yes, who says, what social ranks did the Carthusians at Champmont come from?
Oh, no, I was thinking of the one, we can do that one, but I was thinking about where does the cross face in relation to the building complex?
Oh, yes.
There's two. So he asked two. Okay, social ranks Carthusian come from often very high, but not always. I mean, actually, we know remarkably little about individual Carthusian monks, I would say. But the prior at this moment, during the whole process of creating the Great Cross, and he must have been very influential. His role was, I'm sure, very important. Is someone who has diplomatic roles. He goes to Paris. He goes to Avignon. He meets with the Pope. He's someone he's much more embedded in the highest level of politics than we would expect. So I would say that the prior at that point is someone really fundamental. It's called Jean de Vaux. But it faces towards, the cross faces towards the church. So kind of makes the front of the cross. That was another thing, that realizing that actually that drawing's a little bit weird, the way that the building, it makes it look like the building's off center. It's not. It was actually in the center of the cloister.
Susie, there's a couple of questions about why only the Magdalene at the foot of the cross.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, I mean, I've sort of spent most of the 2008 article trying to explain that. And it's not without precedent that there are other instances where you have crucifixes with just the Magdalene. I think the way to think about this monument is not a crucifixion that was then depopulated. It was not I think Sluter and Philip and the prior didn't, in a way, remove iconography from the cross. What they did was add the Magdalene, so that most crosses most monumental stone crosses would not have any figures like this. They won't have tiny little figures on the ends of the cross, maybe, but they wouldn't have a group of figures at the bottom of the cross here. And I think we imagine they're there because we just think about it like a crucifixion. But actually, by adding the Magdalene, you're kind of expanding the iconography, adding this extra dramatic moment. And so I think that's one way of thinking about it. The other way is thinking that just, structurally and technically, it makes a lot more sense not to have these other figures. I think there would have been a challenge up there. That's one thing. And I think the other thing is the Magdalene was hugely important for the Carthusians. She is the model for their devotional practice in so many ways. And I think that highlighting her here, there was, for example, a Carthusian monastery outside Leuven which was devoted just to the Magdalene at the foot of the cross. And I think this is something you can, partly because she led the contemplative life. She sat at the feet of Christ. She didn't lead an active life, so she could be seen as a model for the Carthusians. And so I think there is so many things going on in this choice. It may be about visual impact of this figure that I'm sure was polychromed in red at the foot of the cross there, and the way that she feeds into ideas about sorrow, and the way that she actually expands the monument rather than kind of contracts it. So, I mean, it's difficult because, you know, in taking away John and the Virgin, it was like I sort of removed two pieces of French patrimony from the object, but they never, I mean, it's not like they just were never there. I mean, I think that it's so clear. So I think then you have to think, what does the Magdalene do alone? And I think visually her alone is very, very powerful.
Somebody asks about the physical evidence of that and asks, is there enough space between the folded arms and the body to
Yeah.
allow for the post of the cross?
Yeah. Yeah. The cross was very thin. And I mean, I think I wanted, so in the new reconstruction, I made it thicker than in the old one, but we know the diameter of the cross because the fragments that were found in the 19th century were measured, and the diameter of the column was 15 centimeters, I think 15 and a half centimeters. It's really not very wide. And from the arms, you can see, so the arms are crossed like this. And on the inside, there is a carved element exactly where the cross went. So you can see that they fitted round the cross. There's no doubt that they were meant to be around the cross like that. And you can also see, I sort of, you know, tried to kind of do a reconstruction. I put a circle of that diameter exactly where the circle was, and it fits perfectly. So I think there's no doubt that A, the cross was very thin, and B, that there was room with the arms.
And somebody, Mia Banks, asked, where are these elements kept now? They're in the museum in Dijon, aren't they?
So the arms and the legs are in the Musée Archéologique, which is so not the Beaux-Arts, and they are now on display. When I was first studying this, they weren't on display. They kept them in store, so people hadn't really been able to examine them and think about them. But now they are on display, and they're also with the bust of Christ, which was always thought to be from the well, but that's a whole other story. That is clearly not from the well and wasn't found in the well.
Do you want to go to Emily Pegg's
Yes.
question? He
Yeah.
says, hi, Susie. Has anyone tried to do technical imaging on the residual polychromy of the text in Jeremiah's open book? And to what extent or not is a nearly 16th century copy helpful in working out the original appearance? And congrats on a super article, she says.
Thank you, Emily. It's very kind. No, and I would. So the fact that there is text on Jeremiah's book is extraordinary because no one can see it except Jeremiah. So it is another reason why he clearly is an unusual and exceptional figure on the cross. And it's impossible to make out what it says. It's one of those things that if I could know something about this monument, that is what I'd want to know. And no, they did when they did the restoration, they didn't do technical imaging. I mean, I think maybe a combination of UV or IR, or, you know, infrared on it would show something. Unfortunately, it's now quite dirty. You know, like the top of the cross now that it's got a layer of dust now. When I photographed it in 2005, when I was up the ladder, I you could see it. You can't see it now. So that's an issue, and also just getting access. You know, you'd need you need to do it in the dark. Maybe if you're going to do UV, you're going to need it's not going to be easy, and it's something I have longed to do, and maybe one day with the right resources. You know, I'm sure Dijon would be keen, but as I say, it's not easy, so it would involve quite a lot. But I'd love to do that because I feel what he's reading is probably would have been really significant. You know, it isn't just there by chance. And the other thing is the 16th century copy helpful in working out the original appearance. Okay, one of the key things about the 16th century copy, which is so interesting, is that it copies all the prophets pretty exactly. It's not very good. Um, but the one prophet whose face has changed is Jeremiah. And he also, I think he's probably still a portrait. I think he's possibly a portrait of uh, uh, possibly Louis the 12th. I don't know. I think it's possible that there's something going on. They recognize that was a portrait and they do a different portrait at that point. So it's interesting. Again, it's a way of pinpointing the fact that Jeremiah's image meant something, because why would you change that and none of the others? But it doesn't tell you anything much else, unfortunately. It was never painted.
I think we have to leave it there. Your questions will be saved, as I said. Maybe I can just put in one final, very quick question of myself.
Mm,
Susie, do you now feel you have tied it all up, or are there still any open questions?
mm. Well, there certainly are. I mean, the book could have been one. You know, I'd like to know. I'd like to know what that said. The reconstruction of the cross, the double cross. I think that's something that I think more could be done on. I still think there are questions about audience that still need to be thought about. You know, I'd like to know more about that still. Um, I think that's really, in a way, you know, I don't feel like I've said the last word on it, that's for sure. But I think the main things I'd like to know would need technical examination now. I tell you what, I wish they'd dredge the well. I think there may be a few fragments left in there. So that's something, you know, maybe if we could find what that cross looked like is the really, and you know, that's annoying. You know, we don't really know. And I'd love to find a few bits of that so we had more of a sense
Mm.
of we know some things about it, but not much. And I just do want to say, just because I noticed a question that I think is worth maybe someone asked, did Philip the Bold visit frequently? And actually, he never went back to Dijon after he saw his son off on crusade there in 1396. And so he is directing this from afar, but we know he's very good at doing that. And also the thing to say is that John, when he comes back, he's in Dijon a lot of the time, and I think his son is probably in charge of the project for some years. But it is, and I wonder if him not going back to Dijon is because you know, he feels so deeply about this. I mean, there may be other reasons too, but political ones. But fascinatingly, you know, it's not something he never saw the finished product.
Mm. Well, thank you, Susie. If Monsieur le Maire of Dijon is listening, we hope he can be persuaded to drag the well. But for now, thank you so much for all sharing all the information and your insights on this on behalf of the Burlington Magazine. We are very grateful.
Thank you.
And
It's a pleasure.
thank you. And thanks also to London Art Week for their interest and for making this part of their series. And there's two more things I should say. First of all, this will be recorded. So it will come up soon and people can listen again, or those who haven't can listen to it. And also, on behalf of London Art Week, I would like to say that tomorrow is their last event in the Art History in Focus series, and it will be a tour of an exhibition at David Masson Fine Art. I'm sure that will be wonderful. Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much, Susie.
Thank you.